Welcome to the Housing Digital Micro Conference on revolutionising tenant repayment agreements in social housing, sponsored by Voicescape. In this micro conference, we will explore the complex issue of managing tenant repayment agreements. Social landlords across the sector are sharing the challenges they face with informal, high-risk repayment agreements, leading to significant unrecovered debt. A range of industry experts will share best practice on how to reduce break rates, minimise arrears, and improve financial outcomes for both housing providers and their tenants. We'll move on to our next keynote speaker, who I'm quite excited to hear from. I'm always good to have a scientist speaking on in one of our events. So I'd like to welcome Stephen Johnson, who's an independent behavioural insights advisor. Stephen, you are free to take over the screen.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Stephen Johnson. I'm, as outlined, independent behavioural insights advisor. I've been working in this space now for over 20 years, all things behaviour change and applied behavioural science. But a good chunk of that time has been spent working in social housing and with social housing providers and with income teams. And working very closely with Voicescape through that time on product development, and specifically in this context in relation to understanding the behavioural dynamics behind agreements, and how we can use those to better improve our processes, our practice, and in this case, our systems. Next slide, Steve. So as Steve mentioned, we've been conducting research around the role of agreements for a number of years now. So the insights that we're going to share today and which underpin the Agreements Manager solution, they're rooted in a wide range of sources, both from our own research, from evidence across the sector, and from the wider behavioural science literature. So as Steve alluded to, we've done statistical analyses of rent accounts now for over 30 landlords within our own customer base over the last 5 years. I personally have run quite a wide-ranging qualitative research exercise with officers and managers and teams. We've run co-creation workshops with income teams, and we've done a best practice evidence review both within the sector and outside the sector when it comes to agreements management processes. We also did an analysis of over 50 landlord income management policies to try and understand where agreements are featuring within those kind of official documents. And as always, we'll be running ongoing trials to test, learn and optimize the interventions and messaging that are attached to the Agreements Manager process, so that we're continually increasing their effectiveness and optimizing that impact. The next slide, Steve. So one of the key things that rang clear through all that research that we've done is the huge potential that agreements have as an arrears collection tool, potentially the most powerful and important tool we have in the box. So yeah, at a basic level, the power of agreements, they're there to help us reduce debt in a way that's manageable for the customer and beneficial to the landlord. But underneath those basics, there's a range of other benefits that a well-managed agreement brings for the customers, for the officers, and for the business more generally. So for the customer, it creates choice, and that's important, something that customers can actively do to address their arrears. That kind of, I guess, a sense of control that they have that can help protect psychological well-being. It can help reduce stigma, and especially when we think about the shame and embarrassment that often comes with being in debt, that element of control can be hugely important for a customer. But importantly, it also gives officers a choice as well. So we know chasing people for money that they potentially don't have or they're struggling to find is stressful, and nobody really wants to escalate if there are other options on the table. So agreements impact officers and teams in positive ways, as well as just customers. And by the way, over the next few slides, you'll see a range of quotes down the right-hand side of the slides that are verbatim quotes that we've taken from that wide-ranging piece of qualitative research that I mentioned. So this is all word of mouth kind of evidence, in a sense, that we've taken from income officers and teams through our research. So in addition to creating choice, they help relationships. So the possibility of an agreement allows us to have conversations that are framed more with a kind of a solutions focus rather than a problem focus. Not what's wrong, but what can we do to fix it? And over time, those kind of more relational rather than purely transactional interactions, they can actually effectively improve that landlord-tenant relationship and build trust and increase the likelihood of engagement going forward. And as far as the wider business goes, when agreements are underpinned by good data and they're therefore well managed and they're run through well-designed processes, they can also have risk and reputational benefits in terms of getting ahead on compliance and regulation and being perceived to be kind of fair and correct in how we run the process. And of course, yeah, the bottom line is that if all this comes together as we'd like, then agreements, if managed well, should be a key lever for increasing collections, reducing costs, and ultimately sustaining tenancies as well. But saying that, as Steve alluded to, what's also clear in the research we found is that when they're not managed well, agreements can actually become part of the problem rather than a key part of the solution. Again, both for the customer and the business. So in terms of costs and times, those high break rates result in multiple agreements being made and remade, and that generates pressure on teams, creates a lot of work for officers to chase those broken agreements and then remake them or seek other resolutions. And in terms of collections and as far as the customer experience goes, again, from a behavioral science point of view, this cyclical making and breaking of agreements can actually contribute to the normalization of arrears and non-payment. It creates a sort of positive reinforcement for non-payment because customers are allowed to continually cycle around making and breaking agreements. And next slide, Steve, please. So despite the potential power of an agreement, our research has shown clearly that there's a number of key challenges that prevent income teams unlocking that potential. So firstly, again, Steve alluded to this, the HMS, the housing management system. So across the board, we're finding that the HMS is rarely fit for purpose when it comes to supporting management of agreements. It seems that this is kind of a perennial issue that we've just gotten used to and that we live with day to day, and we find manual workarounds to deal with. So the subsector seems to have struggled with this for many years, but the software companies just seem to have failed to respond to this for some reason. So just the basic task of identifying if and when an agreement is actually broken is in itself a huge challenge. And this means that officers are often chasing agreements that aren't actually broken, or they're overlooking those agreements that are those false positives and false negatives that Steve alluded to. And what this means in many cases is that the limitations are so profound that teams simply stop using the HMS module to manage their agreements, which means then they end up managing agreements in ad hoc case notes, or as some people said in our research, in officers' heads, or through attempts to develop some workaround in-house system tools, which are all far from ideal when it comes to such an important part of the process. Next slide, please. And secondly, data. So simply not having the right information to hand to support those officer conversations and the decisions that need to be made in those situations, another key limitation. And we're not necessarily talking about complex, sophisticated information and data. It's even down to basic information like how many previous agreements have been made with this customer, how many were completed, what were the installment amounts, how much was cleared, etc. So just some of the basics are kind of conspicuous by their absence, really. And this is a real hindrance to teams. And I guess as well as that lack of data for officers on the front line, this more general poor recording of agreements data means that managers and directors, people in more strategic positions, don't have the management information then to properly manage the risk associated with agreements. And to forecast and to plan and to target resource accordingly. So there's a huge opportunity from a kind of a management information point of view there to if we can effectively plug that information gap. And next slide. And thirdly, terms. So negotiating the installment amounts and the agreement durations that are affordable and therefore sustainable for the customer. but at the same time make a meaningful impact on the debt. Getting to those terms a key challenge for a number of different reasons. But if they're negotiated too high, then the agreement breaks because it's not affordable. If they're too low, the arrears will just take a ridiculous amount of time to clear, in which time both the business and the customer are continuing to carry the debt with all the negative consequences of that. And I love the quote at the end of that little block there that came from one of our customers. Sometimes the installments amounts are set so low, especially when it comes to court mandated, that they'll be dead by the time they clear this. We're literally talking decades duration for an agreement. So this revolves around kind of addressing this terms challenge will revolve around agreeing an instalment amount which sits in that Goldilocks zone, essentially a sweet spot that's low enough to be sustainable but high enough to impact the debt in a reasonable time frame. And that's not easy given everything else that we've already discussed. Next slide, please, Steve. So as well as these internal systems and process limitations, we're, again, from the research, also facing a wider range of external factors that impact on the performance of agreements. And this potentially could answer part of the previous question we had from the group in terms of, why are people not able to keep up with their agreements? And the research that we did included a wide-ranging evidence review of these factors. And like rent payment more generally, we've found that they're varied, they're complex, and they're operating at multiple levels. So there are structural factors in play, such as the wider economic conditions, the benefit systems, and the continual changes and confusion that causes. There's social factors related to community norms and debt culture. There's individual factors, of course, related to attitude towards debt, demographics, and past behaviours. But then there are also factors associated with the agreement itself. So how we make and manage that agreement, the processes and the systems and the tools that we have to manage agreements, all of which impact the likelihood that an agreement will complete or break. But as probably many of us know from the front line, captured in this quote on the right-hand side here, this sense that there's just too much life happening for our customers. It's tough and getting tougher. In terms of addressing those factors, increasing the success of agreements, we have to be clear on where we can have an impact and how best we can have that impact. Because we need to be mindful that many of these factors are outside of our control, even outside of the customer's control, especially at those structural and social levels. But there are definitely factors that are within our control, and that's where we need to concentrate the improvement efforts. And like I say, specifically the processes we design to make and manage agreements and the system tools we use to support those processes are within our control. So let's optimize and maximize there. And with that in mind, moving on to the next slide, Steve. What we did as part of this research process is review the behavioral science evidence base to develop this best practice framework for making and managing agreements. And we're using this to support income teams, and we've used it to underpin the product development that resulted in Agreements Manager. Now, we don't have time to go through this in massive amounts of detail today, but I'd be happy to do, have a follow-up chat session, etc., separately to unpack this in more detail if some of this more granular level detail is of interest. But very briefly, you'll see that we've got here collaboration and communication that are representing the top and tail, fundamental to the whole process in terms of these key pillars of best practice. So an agreement, and this is the reason we call it an agreement, almost by definition needs to be a collaboration between the officer and the customer, or the landlord and the customer. So, an agreement necessarily needs two parties. And beyond just giving the customer a say in how much they pay, and that being collaboration, there's other psychological dynamics behind that collaboration principle when it's applied properly that are powerful for building and increasing commitment and accountability. when it comes to sticking to payments and adhering to terms. Communication, unsurprisingly, is key. But again, going beyond the obvious there's various things that we can do and we've baked into the system when it comes to how and when we communicate with customers that help give those customers the best possible chance of success in the face of those competing factors, competing payments, various cognitive biases that are in play, emotional tensions. So we can use communication in the most effective way possible. Conditionality relates to the danger of agreements being perceived as an automatic entitlement, so an unconditional and guaranteed option. Because with unconditional access to agreement, we end up devaluing that importance. If everyone always can land on agreement if they miss a payment, devalues the importance, it normalizes the arrears and can diminish the commitment to sticking to the terms. So somehow introducing an element of eligibility kind of slows down those wear-out effects. As mentioned, installment amounts and agreement durations are also key predictors of success. So this brings us to a consideration of cadence, by which we mean the importance of optimizing the frequency and the value of those payments to create an agreement that's both achievable and impactful for the business. Commitment. So without some sense of psychological commitment, it's easy for customers to kind of give themselves internal permission to miss the payments. So incorporating commitment devices specifically within the system and our communications helps set the agreement up for success. But then it also creates opportunities ongoing to kind of reinforce and reactivate those commitment devices as things progress and as a wider range of communications roll out. Consequences. An absence of negative consequences for breaking an agreement is definitely a key challenge. As I mentioned earlier, the absence of a negative consequence for non-payment actually can effectively positively reinforce non-payment. Whereas on the other hand, as you can imagine, rewarding adherence, that's controversial in some areas, I know, but rewarding adherence and payment, even if it's just through gratitude and ego appeals, so thank yous and well dones essentially, has been shown to positively reinforce behaviours and help build new habits. And the last principle there, competition, to be borne in mind. As we know, in many cases, rent and agreement payments are in active and I guess often fierce competition with a range of other payments that the customer needs to make or wants to make. So whilst it's essential that we collect with care, and again, that's baked through this process, timely, robust intervention is going to be vital to ensure that we're helping customers to pay their priority debt, to pay the rent and protect the security of their home. Next slide, please, Steve. So continuing this best practice journey is a complement to the best practice framework and those behavioural science principles that we're baking in to systems and processes. We built out an outline process to help implement that in practice, but then also to underpin the functions and the features and functionality of the Agreements Manager product. So what we've done with this is identify the key golden moments, the key communication touch points that offer the greatest opportunity when it comes to making and managing agreements and increasing the effectiveness of the likelihood that they're going to be completed. So we go through engage, assess, negotiate, confirm, remind, and reinforce. So we need to secure a conversation with the customer in the first place. We need to engage them. We need to assess the case, understand their circumstances, and explore options for resolution. That's where the collaboration principle becomes absolutely key, and for that to be manifest properly and committed to authentically. We have a negotiation phase where we're arriving at those terms, terms that are affordable for the customer and impactful for the business. Beyond that, the terms have been agreed. Then we have some key phases that we found are very rarely apparent in current processes when it comes to how income teams are managing agreements. So we confirm, we remind, and we reinforce. So a confirmation is sent to the customer, reinforcing those terms, underlining those terms in a timely fashion after they've been made. Reminders before the payment is due, And then crucially, to the point around lack of consequences, there is a reinforce stage where we respond to the customer's behaviour, whether that's positively or negatively, whether they're adhering, whether their agreement is drifting, breaking, or broken. So across any process, using any context, using any system, we've identified this as a best practice series of steps to take. And if we move on to the next slide, we can show then how that is kind of baked in and really underpins the specific features and functionality within Agreements Manager. So at the engage phase, we've got a system through Caseload Manager that issues an outbound contact that is optimized to secure a conversation. So we increase the likelihood that we get an engagement from that customer. At the assess case, where we're discussing those circumstances, then the wide range of information that we have access to within Agreements Manager provides the foundation for those conversations, provides the information to have more informed, empathetic conversations around assessing those circumstances and arriving at a resolution. We know the customer in more detail. At the negotiate phase, again, as he alluded to, arriving at that optimum amount, that golden moment, that Goldilocks sort of sweet spot. There's various recommendations that the system can make, evidence-based recommendations on what those optimum value, installment value to duration, agreement duration figures might be. So again, functionality to support that negotiation piece. And then throughout the confirm, remind and reinforce stage, then we've got automated communications fueled and powered by behaviorally informed nudges to make those phases relatively easy to implement and highly effective when it comes to reinforcing the commitment that customers have made and keeping them on track with their agreement payments. So ultimately providing data, insights and recommendations to support those customer conversations and issuing automated outbound communications that are all optimized with behaviorally informed messaging across that process. Okay, so that's been a quick whistle-stop tour of some of the research and insights that we've been building in relation to agreements. As mentioned, there's more of this in the white paper that we launched this week, but I'd also be happy to catch up separately on anything that we've covered there if you'd like to kind of dig into a bit more detail. So there's been a lot of theory there, I appreciate, and I'm sure they're going to hand over to Shirley Onward for kind of a more tangible and frontline view of some of these challenges. But in the meantime, I'd be more than happy to answer any questions.
Hi.
Brilliant. Thank you, Stephen. Much appreciated. Right, we'll move straight into questions. Have you got some questions for Stephen, please?
I have. It's Mark Cantrell, editor of Housing Digital.
Hi, Mark.
Hi. There was a lot to digest there, but listening to it and taking it in, it's like I'm getting the impression that there's a lot of behaviour change you're looking to incorporate on the tenant side, on the landlord side there. I mean, like, you know, you're in debt or you feel like you're going to drop into debt, you're going to get stressed, as you mentioned. And you're going to, I don't know, maybe become defensive, maybe run away from the problem. But on the landlord or the organisational side, there may be a tendency to get a bit stern and authoritarian, like, hey, pal, you owe me money, I want it back. So you seem to be suggesting a way of encouraging a process which is, I don't know, friendlier, if I can put it that way, more humane, encouraging the tenant to come out of a defensive posture.
Absolutely.
But equally the landlord to be less stern and work with the tenant. So is that basically the whole gist of this?
In a sense, yeah. And I think the agreement as a principle, as a tool, as a mechanism really exemplifies that collect with care approach and the need to obviously get the money in, but to do that in a way which isn't unfair or applying unreasonable levels of pressure on tenants. Because within that agreement context, you know, we're coming to an agreement, you know, literally, okay, what can you afford and what's going to be good for us? We both know this isn't an ideal situation. We don't want you to be in debt and for your own sake, and we don't want to be in debt from a business point of view. So what we're looking at as an optimal way to work through that together. So just the principle of having an agreement, I think, points to that and opens the door to some of that kind of perceived fairness. But yeah, as to your point more specifically, what we're trying to do then is bake that approach into not just our automated communications, but also into empowering officers to have those sorts of conversations as well. Talking to officers, many officers are already very sensitive to and very empathetic and authentic in how they're going about assessing and negotiating agreements. But nevertheless, if our process and our system can help support those conversations even more and support those decisions, all the better. But to your point, yeah, it's very much how do we get as much money in as we can without applying undue and unfair pressure on what are often hard-pressed customers.
Thanks for that.
Does that answer your question, Mark?
Yeah.
Good. Can we have some more questions for Stephen, please?
Hi, Stephen. So my name's Paul. I'm a services manager in a homeless hostel, and our tenants are on license agreements. Would you feel that your principles of making these payment plans, etc., are equally viable and applicable and can be used in the same way because obviously it's a different type of tenancy being here in a hostel?
Yeah, I would have thought so, Paul. I mean, I guess the principle comes back to, what is an affordable or reasonable and fair option for our customer, for our residents, but that nevertheless respects the need, the needs that the business has to get money in and to reduce arrears. So I don't know your context specifically, but if the question is how do we strike a balance where we can still have revenue coming in from a customer who is in debt, a resident who is in debt, and therefore the resident is reducing their debt and the psychological pressure that can come with that, and at the same time contributing to reducing their arrears from the landlord's point of view, then I guess the same principle stands. How do we arrive at that optimum kind of repayment value, and how do we arrive at that fair arrangement for both parties? But I'm not sure if that answers your question, given how specific your context might be.
So I was listening intently, and I've just picked up on something you said about the absence of negative consequences. This is great having a system that works and chases for you, etc., etc. But at what point do you get external sort of agencies involved? Because if you don't have a negative consequence, isn't it at that point you need to evidence and measure and show maybe law enforcement what's going on, and maybe get involved in the wider sense of the universe, I guess, rather than just on particularly about housing associations and housing agreements. Sort of a wider question that kind of is big, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. It's a great point, Gillian, because we want to collect with care and everything, but at the end of the day, we need to get the money in. And regardless of an individual organisation's trigger points for things like getting enforcement agencies in, we still want to, I guess, embody that principle. But when it does come to that point, if you've got a system that has reliably and rigorously collected the data associated with how you have dealt with that case thus far, for things like pre-action protocol and supporting court cases should it get to that point, then there's a huge benefit in having a very clear set of data and evidence that documents exactly what we've tried to do to resolve this case fairly with this customer before we've taken this last resort of going to court and seeking eviction or whatever those more enforcement-based processes. So yeah, it comes back to that data point as well. There'll be plenty of evidence to support that enforcement piece if you managed agreements in this way.
Yeah, exactly. I think that was my point of maybe like it's a really good basis and a really good platform to sort of gather all the information and show what you've done so far before it goes forward. But yeah, it's a big question, isn't it? And it is a problem. But obviously, reason why you've put together all this information. Sorry, I got a follow-up point as well. Housing associations obviously notoriously don't have a lot of money. So in sort of learning this best practice and your behavioral science, etc., is that's going to be a little bit of a training procedure. So what's the sort of training situation? What would you do with a housing association and etc.? Maybe it's worth asking that as well.
Yeah, sure. So as we kind of onboard customers to be using the system, then there'll be associated training and access to the best practice resources that we've been discussing today, because we see them being knitted as like two sides of the same coin, really. That if you're going to get the best out of the system, then ideally the process and practice within the team would also flex to a certain extent or change to a certain extent to dovetail with the principles that have underpinned the process. So there would be an element of that best practice training that came through the implementation process as we onboard Agreements Manager.
All that's left is a brief summary of each of our keynotes. We first obviously heard from Steve, who is the sector lead at Voicescape. Steve summarise the sector challenges associated with repayment agreements from extensive sector research. 90% of agreements fail, which is astounding. 90% of agreements fail within 3 to 6 months. Up to 50% of arrears are tied up in them. There seems to be a constant cycle of making, breaking, and chasing. And Steve introduced the solution to this, which is, of course, the Agreements Manager. We then heard from our independent behavioural insights advisor, Stephen Johnson. Stephen presented how Agreements Manager is behavioural science backed, looking at what factors impact agreement success, including social factors that are a big part of the problem. As per the quote, there is too much life happening out there for residents. Stephen went on to explain the golden moments of communication and to get this right, to keep agreements on track to maintain sustainable tenancies for the future. And then we finally heard briefly from Shirley McFarlane, who is the income management team leader at Onward Homes. Shirley presented Onward's historical battle with agreements and how it has always been a priority for them to solve. One case study is where a resident was paying £4.50 a week on a 4K debt, which would take decades to repay. Shirley then shared why Onward are going on a journey with Agreements Manager, some of the reasons why they like the system, but advised that the power of gratitude cannot be ignored ever. Thank you to everyone who attended today's micro conference. We are wrapping up slightly early today. Just a reminder to all attendees, if you haven't already registered on Housing Digital, please do so. It's free. It means you can access content like this, the recordings of all our previous micro conferences. You can interact on our secure social wall. You can advertise jobs free of charge on Housing Digital as a logged in member. I will share the link now. No, that's not the link. But if you head on to housingdigital.co.uk/register, like I say, it is free to register for an account there. Other than that, we hope to see you at a future micro conference. Please join me in saying a big thank you to our keynote speakers, and we hope to see you again soon.